It all started in Bronx, New York, when a pregnant Faith Bradley, who was a professor of comparative religion, witnessed her husband, Isaiah Bradley, being drafted into the 8-year War of Resistance in February of 1942. And in that same year, after the birth of their daughter, Sarah Gale, Faith received an army letter of condolence in the month of June, stating her husband had tragically perished in an explosion. Unsurprisingly, the next month, Faith insisted on seeing what remained of her deceased husband after the military arranged his funeral to be a closed casket. So when she received the opportunity to view what was in her husband's casket, she discovered in horror the charred up remains of a frail Caucasian male. So now visibly horrified and upset, she took her grievance to the U.S. Army headquarters within New York, demanding answers on what they were covering up about her husband's supposed death, only to receive a stern denial of any wrongdoing on behalf of the military by the major before she was sent on her way. Interestingly enough, a black corporal officer by the name of Eddie Hems admired Faith's self-motivation so much, he rushed out to comfort her and explained that during an explosive blast involving multiple personnel, it's nearly impossible to identify the victims individually. So the Army tried their best effort to gather as much body parts as possible in order to give to the families so they could receive closure for their loss, which a saddened Faith had to accept, until she later found out by the government her husband was indeed alive and was sentenced to life in prison for being a political liability because he stole Captain America's costume and shield before he was sent on a suicide mission into Nazi Germany. So since she could only afford to see him 3 times a year, she got the full story from him on how he, along with 300 black soldiers, were test subjects for the classified and dangerous super soldier program that took the life of 98% of the black soldiers. Meanwhile, sometime in 1953, Faith, now living in Mount Vernon, Virginia, and constantly under surveillance by the government, was surprisingly visited by a young lady with a baby during one Sunday morning after she escaped a government facility. Claiming the child in her possession, she chose not to give a name, belonged to Isaiah. So Faith invited the young lady into her home to elaborate, which the young lady will reveal black military officers had picked her up from a high school a while back after she fit the profile by having the perfect blood and physical type of what they were looking for in order to pay her to carry and give birth to Isaiah's child as a surrogate after they made dozens of failed attempts to create another super soldier. Furthermore, the military had done this by harvesting Isaiah's sperm cells before he became sterile and fertilized Faith's egg cells after secretly obtaining her appendix when it was removed last year, which was the basis in creating the genetically modified baby they labeled A39 that would be as receptive to the super soldier process as Isaiah was. So Faith came up with the idea to keep the baby by replacing it with her daughter's doll before pretending to chase the young lady away so not to draw suspicion from the government who were constantly on watch. Following this, that evening, now in the Bronx, Faith, who was accompanied by her daughter Sarah Gale, decided to send the baby she named Josiah off behind the boxcar of a train for his safety after seeing beyond the moment of the fear she faced, while also seeing value and potential in her infant child by having faith in God to protect his life during his journey to the unknown. Moreover, after spending years trying to get her husband out of prison, Faith finally got Isaiah out when he was released early on a full pardon after serving 17 years in solitary confinement. So the government next promised to keep her and her husband's ordeal and life secret. Moreover, Faith, a now Muslim woman, also going by the name Faith Shabazz, continued living her life now with her husband and grandchildren as she went on to lecture in the summer semester at Hofstra University before she was surprisingly visited at her home by Captain America Steve Rogers, who recently heard about the existence of Isaiah and wanted to show his respect and hear his story before giving his appreciation, only to shockingly find out the unforeseen side effects of the super soldier serum left Isaiah sterile and childlike, having problems with thinking, remembering, and performing everyday tasks. Meanwhile, in 1965, Josiah grew up in a Catholic orphanage in Boston, where he felt hopeless and abandoned by the love of Jesus Christ. He was taught to worship. So that Friday night, after reading the newspaper about the assassination of the leader in the civil rights movement in support of black nationalism, Minister Malcolm X, Josiah decided to leave the orphanage while, unbeknownst to him, his powers began to manifest before, in a blind fit of rage, striking his teacher, the sarcastic nun, Sister Irenea, instantly knocking her out after she called him the racist term boy. So fearing he accidentally killed her, he fled the orphanage, never to be seen again, until he was seen as a soldier in 1968, fighting in the Vietnam War in the Binh Dinh province, where he helped save the lives of his fellow black soldiers after close air support dropped a firebomb fuel gel mixture on their position. So that night, after they made it back to David Company base camp, Josiah hit the colonel with a sky uppercut for purposely sending an airstrike to kill them all, which got Josiah, who was going by Josiah Smith, court-martialed and sentenced to do time at Leavenworth, Kansas Penitentiary, where he became a practicing Muslim. Before 5 years into his sentence, he was visited by federal agents looking to run a few minor tests on him after observing his odd physical abilities. So the next year, now in Berkeley, California, the government's suspicion was correct, when all signs point to Josiah being the baby that went missing 20 years ago. So now it was their chance to replicate the super soldier serum by mutilating and extracting every last drop of DNA from him. However, luckily for Josiah, the government brought in his surrogate mother to do genetic match tests, which she used that opportunity to introduce herself while vaguely explaining who and what he was, before warning him about his imminent doom she would prevent with the help of others who were willing to put their lives on the line in order to smuggle him out of there. Succeeding this, Josiah would next be seen 4 years later in Harlem, still in hiding, but now part of the Black Power political organization known as the Black Panther Party, with his new female friend, Tammy, who helped him locate the address of his genetic parents, where he would encounter his sister, Sarah Gale, who he initially thought was his mother, since she was the first person to greet him at the door, followed by his mother herself, Faith, who was willing to answer all his questions at a later date, since her home was still being monitored by the government, which fortunately were used to seeing black guests visiting the house to get a glimpse of the urban legend known as Josiah Bradley, the Black Captain America, which Josiah would be mistaken as one, before he had to quickly leave until the time was right to return. So 17 years will pass before 1995, and Josiah will be seen in the Boston Catholic Church praying for forgiveness after killing Sister Irenia 30 years ago and being a hired mercenary these last past years, since he was ready to fully embrace Islam, as he changed his last name to Hajj Saddiq, or just Josiah X, to feel more attached and affiliated with the Muslim community. When suddenly Sister Irenia was the priest standing in the name of Christ and the church he was confessing his sins to behind the booth, which Josiah X was relieved to find out she was alive, even though she didn't recognize him or believe he was who he claimed to be, being that he appeared barely 25 years old. So as time progressed to 7 years later, Josiah X, now a Muslim activist who gained the title of minister after being appointed high priest of bleeding hearts while managing a mosque in Little Mogadishu on Long Island, New York, before receiving a gift in the mail from his genetic mother of a Captain America outfit. Moreover, Minister Josiah X will reside in a multi-million-dollar Grace and Tumboldt community project called Princeton Walk, with Irenia being his housekeeper. So 5 days later, on that Thursday, Minister Josiah X would spend time with his father playing board games in the morning before he had to leave once again. So the government don't go snooping around, when suddenly 3 of his old buddies known as the ex-Air Force Lieutenant Colonel in War Machine, James Rhodey Rhodes, along with the former mercenary and spy Danny Vincent, also known as Genta, and lastly the NYPD officer Kevin Casper Cole, also known as the superhero vigilante White Tiger, who all really didn't want nothing to do with each other, since they all had their own self-interest, but still banded together to form the team called The Crew to go after the killer of James Rhodey Rhodes' sister and declare war on the most powerful street gang in the country called the 66 Bridges Gang, who has a network of corrupt police officers, judges, and politicians on their payroll. That being said, Josiah Hajj Saddiq is Marvel Comics super soldier Minister Josiah X.